Well, thank you all very much for coming in person, and to people who are watching this later online. We're going to have a conversation about development finance and small states. So CGD, in partnership with the Lowy Institute's Indo-Pacific Development Centre. So SIDS are increasingly in focus. There's been the Bridgetown agenda by the Barbados over the last few years. There was the SIDS Forum meeting in May, and the World Bank President's recent visit to the Pacific. With Lowy, CGD has recently put out a paper on how the World Bank can states. So to discuss these issues with us today, so Nimia Dawai, who's an advisor to a World Bank Executive Director and formerly was the head of Fiji's Treasury Department, Dr. Melanie Pill, who's a research fellow at the Indo-Pacific Development Centre at Lowy Institute, and Roland Raj, who directs that centre. And I'm Victoria Diamond. I'm a senior policy analyst here at CGD. So we're going to discuss why SIDS warrant exceptional treatment in the international development finance system, how this is changing as climate vulnerability becomes increasingly understood, discuss what SIDS use this finance for when they have access to it, and what the gaps still are to kind of improve things for these countries. So the first question, just briefly, Nimia, could you please tell us what SIDS are, why they warrant exceptional treatment, and how this is changing? Thanks.
So your paper as well. I think small states is a term used in the bank, referring to 1.5 million or less in a certain geography. Also includes small state forum members. In the bank, there's around 50 countries that are small state forum members. Only 40 meet the classification of 1.5 million or less. Some are above that, but they have similar challenges. I think all of you. Let me repeat why small states deserve exceptional support from MDBs and international platforms, is because of the size, small size, remoteness, and vulnerability. So because of their size, the impact of natural disasters as a percentage of GDP is much more. Because of their size, in terms of the economy, they have much more narrow economic basis, usually reliant on one or two sectors. And in my region, mostly tourism or fisheries. And because of their remoteness, in the event of natural disasters, average cost per construction or reconstruction is significantly higher than in most other developed countries. So recently, the increase in intensity and frequency of natural disasters have left a cycle of response and recovery for small states that have left economic scarring and have really impacted their ability to continue their development paths. To give you an example, in Fiji, Cyclone Winston hit in 2016 with damages of around 30% to GDP. And during COVID, not only were we struck by COVID and we were heavily tourism reliant in Fiji, we also struck by several disasters. So we had the fall. My colleague from Vanuatu is here. In 2023, Vanuatu was hit by 3 Category 4 cyclones in a span of 7 months. The first 2 were in a span of 3 days. Post-disaster needs assessment comes to around $1 billion. So these are the significant and real challenges that are faced. And I see it constantly in my previous role, where we have to constantly shift around our budgets to focus on recovery and response efforts. I'll leave it there.
And then, Melanie, could you talk to us a little bit about how that plays out in the international finance system in terms of access countries have? Thanks. Thank you. Just switch.
Well, thanks, Victoria, for the question. Thanks for dates. Maybe to add to that, there's just increase of impacts from the impacts are really existential for small island developing states due to those extreme weather events, but also sea level rise causing loss of territory. So maybe just to add to that as well. So in terms of the broader picture of the international finance for SIDS, I think I don't have to tell you that it is quite large and hard to navigate. We all know that. And it is never straightforward, and how to apply and where to apply, and whether the application flies at the time, and what the preferences are of donors or the board, and they're all different requirements as well. So that's really a huge problem for the Pacific. And then there is different application requirements. I've mentioned that have to start applications from scratch for every single fund, and they are very labor intensive. And then when you start having building capacity, or the capacity is just not there, often consultants come in, deliver, and then fly out. So we have that fly in, fly out approach that is really, really not helpful for SIDS. I mean, no country really, but really problematic, especially for capacity constraints, small island states. And one thing I think that's really important for small island developing states is also that grants are what is mostly needed due to the lack of bankable projects that can be done. Even if we look at renewable energy and mitigation, that is usually projects that do have a financial return. That's really hard to do in the Pacific, and that's usually an adaptive measure or resilience building measure there. So grants is really what is needed. And I think that other ways of accessing finance, when we don't just look at the climate change funds, the multilateral funds that are out there, are, for example, the Pacific Resilience Facility or bilateral agreements between countries. And maybe Nimia can talk to that, or representatives that have here for the government of Vanuatu, that this is sometimes actually a preferred method of receiving funds, because it's less onerous, less administrative costs, and less administrative burdens on SIDS. Yeah, that's it from my end. If there are any questions, yeah, let me know.
Great, thank you. So now we're just going to drill down quickly into the World Bank and its concessional lending arm, IDA. So Rowan and I just worked on a paper with Georgia Hammersley, also at Lowy. Can you tell us why IDA is so vital to SIDS?
We cover a lot of different issues in the paper, so I sort of what are just a few of the highlights to mention. I mean, I think why is IDA so important to SIDS? It's the short answer is simply that obviously it does a lot in SIDS, and so in the paper actually we focus on small states, and just a few sort of stats capture the sort of scale of why it's important. Around half of small states have access to IDA. IDA tends to play a fairly outsized role in small states compared to non-small states. So our calculations, about a third of all development assistance going into small states is coming from IDA, compared to about a quarter for non-small states. And because small states tend to be more aid dependent, that's also a bigger share of GDP. So the amount of IDA support tends to be in the range of 3 to 4% of GDP for small states compared to lower elsewhere. So IDA is playing a big role. I think the other element is that, of course, IDA also provides special preferences and treatment towards small states. Many of our colleagues here from the World Bank are well aware of that through what used to be the small island economy exemption, now the small economies exemption, pretty much the same thing. Small countries up to 1.5 million people and below the high income country cutoff line, but critically above the regular cutoff line for normally having access to IDA. And so for 23 small states, the World Bank is currently allowing them to continue to access IDA and concessional financing. Now, one of the interesting things and an important contribution, I think, in this paper that we've done, and Vic did a lot of the hard work on this, so I've got to give props to her, is looking at how IDA is targeting vulnerability in terms of eligibility. So now, obviously, as we've heard and we all know, in terms of the added emphasis on trying to address climate vulnerability, but there's a big push to make sure that vulnerability is a key factor in deciding who has access to concessional financing, and some push to incorporate the MVI, Multidimensional Vulnerability Index, explicitly into how IDA makes its eligibility decisions. And what we show in the paper is simply that actually already through the small economies exemption, IDA is actually doing a pretty good job of targeting vulnerability on a more sort of case-by-case kind of basis. But if you try and link it to an index, a measure of vulnerability of some kind, if you look at the main indices that people are using, the credible ones out there. If a country is, a small state, less than 1.5 million people, and not a high-income country, and rated as vulnerable by one of these indices, then it's in the small states, a small economies exemption. So it is targeting that kind of vulnerability pretty well. And that extends also, if you think about the MVI as well. So MVI the issue with MVI is that it would broaden to some extent who gets incorporated, but the countries that would be added if you were to incorporate MVI would be high income countries at the end of the day, right? And so that's much more questionable. Conversely, if you were to use MVI formulaically rather than as just an input into how the decision is made, you would end up dropping something like a third of the lower income small states that currently have access to IDA. So the immediate implication of that is that adopting MVI or any one index, all the indices have some sort of problem, right, along these lines. Adopting any one index formulaically would be problematic. Current approach is a bit more, allows for a lot more judgment, and our sort of pitch is that broadly that seems to work pretty well. There's still a question, of course, about what you do about countries that are still quite vulnerable in many ways, highly vulnerable to climate change, but are high income countries. But when, one of the things we've been grappling with and interesting to discuss with this group is the fact that, well, we are in a resource constrained world. For most of we need concessional finance. There's a limited amount of that. Most of the time we're talking about grants as well, and there's an even more limited amount of that to go around. So there are big question marks if one was to try and expand that to a broader set of high income countries. And the final thing just to say that we cover in the paper, which is relevant to why IDA is important, is that it is playing an increasingly important role in providing that kind of post-disaster financing, which I think we should think of as that kind of more contingent financing, right? The deferred drawdown option and the ability to use allocations more flexibly. The key thing that we zero in on is that flexibility is very good, and because small island states are more vulnerable and hit by a lot of shocks, they are going to take up flexibility more often than others. It's more valuable to them than others. But what's really needed is a bit more scale, right? Or a lot more scale in that post-disaster context. And that's not necessarily what's more coming through with the latest sort of changes, but not that much as yet. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Robin. So Numia, you were kind enough to review the paper for us, given your wealth of experience. Could you give us some reactions to it in terms of some of the proposals, whether you think they work or there are things that are missing as well? Thanks.
It's small states, the vulnerability of small states and the critical need for access to finance, especially for adaptation efforts and continuing the development ambitions. I believe it comes at a critical junction where we are currently in ongoing discussions of the 21st replenishment of IDA, which is one of the largest pools of concessional funding in the world, around 91 billion every 3 years. So I think it has really helped, along with other advocacy from our development partners and small states themselves. I think ongoing discussions are pointing to that small states will be ring-fenced from any hardening of terms if replenishments do not reach optimal levels. It makes a good case, one that I agree with, in terms of vulnerability, that the bank has been doing a lot on vulnerability for quite some time now. It just hasn't been making much noise about it. Not to say that the MVI is not useful. It does have limitations when it comes to application for an MDB, but it may be useful in some form for other climate funds. I think the paper also touches on our expanded crisis response toolkit, which is something that small states will look to use, especially given their vulnerabilities and the frequency of natural disasters, something that will be part of our overall disaster risk financing packages. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So now keeping IDA in mind, but stepping back to the global financing picture, when SIDS get this exceptional access to this finance, how do they use it and what do they use it for? Nimia, you were just talking about particularly the disaster toolkit by the World Bank.
Yeah, so when we use concessional funding, it's usually for our development ambitions, mostly infrastructure, mostly towards adaptation. Adaptation projects are quite tedious and expensive, mostly borne by the government and taxpayers. Mostly infrastructure spending, we've moved a lot towards budget support, especially during the COVID period. It helped a lot with counter-cyclical financing, but also at the same time helps continue the pace of reforms. We are able to push a lot of reforms. Specifically in my previous role, reform being pegged to money really helped sometimes to push it along political lines. In terms of moving forward, yes, most of the funding, a good component will go towards allocation towards the expanded crisis response toolkit. I think the catastrophe deferred drawdown option will be one of the main tools that we use. And one of the major reasons is because it's within our control. So it's contingent upon government declaring a natural disaster based on the damages faced. Other instruments that we have are the climate resilient debt clause, which are debt pauses, and you have your catastrophe insurance, right? They're subject to you meeting triggers, specific wind speed, specific rainfall. Sometimes we can get a lot of damage without meeting those triggers. So there's a lot of damage that can happen without meeting triggers, and the CAT-DDO is something that is within the control of governments, that they can declare natural disaster. And now with a rapid response option, other countries are able to beef up the amounts that are within the deferred drawdown options by transferring, I say, 10-20% to the CAT-DDO, which I think will be one of our main instruments moving forward. In terms of challenges, as mentioned before by Melanie, I think capacity. The problem with small states is because of our challenges, most of our people look to go outside for greener pastures. There's a constant cycle of people leaving our ministries, which does impact capacity and institutional knowledge. So this is a case that we have been making on the board of the bank, which is when it comes to small states, there needs to hands-on implementation support for all projects must be the norm rather than the exception. So we need it for all projects. The second is because of our need for adaptation and the huge bill that comes along with it, it's really balancing, maintaining that sustainability and the amount of projects that you are able to take on, which is why, as mentioned by Melanie, grant funding is so critical, concessional funding is so critical, and in financing sources such as IDA is so critical for small states.
Thanks. So I was wondering that just to follow on from that question, you mentioned the debt pauses and that sometimes they are not triggered because you're not going, for example, over certain wind speed. I was wondering what role insurance plays, maybe for SIDS as well, because especially parametric insurance.
Yeah, so the same thing. So if you don't meet the certain triggers, there can still be damages if there's 3 repetitive cyclones that just fall below that. So that is outside of our control. Whereas if you're able to declare natural disaster and say, yes, the damages are sufficient that we need funding, it is within control of the government. Not to say that it does not have a role. It's part of an overall financing package, along with DCRDC debt pause. I think the debt pause is sort of a last line of defense when you have those really significant large disasters. I think that's when you want to activate it because you need all the support you could get.
Yeah, and sometimes it doesn't. That's the problem, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, and I think insurance. Yeah, sometimes just for the audience online, and sometimes it doesn't, right? If it's not triggered, then you just won't get that. And I think insurance only covers about 2% of the actual damage anyway, so it's really only for the immediate needs in the direct aftermath of the extreme weather event. So that very problematic there as well.
Okay, thanks. Melanie, would you like to continue and tell us a little bit more about how SIDS use other instruments beyond the World Bank, like FIFs and other things like that?
Yeah, I think, I've already mentioned that small island developing states can access various climate funds, and I think that's something that people don't know. I think there are just various challenges associated with that, especially with the multilateral funds, issues with direct access, issues with the accreditation. That is a very onerous process, and I think we're hearing that again and again. That especially for the Green Climate Fund, for example, the accreditation process is just a barrier to access funds there. But direct access and is really something that I dare say is very important to the Pacific and has been advocated for because it creates more country-sensitive outcomes. Countries and community groups have more ownership over those projects, and yeah, it is especially for if we have small community groups, for example, or indigenous groups that would like to access funding from those multilateral funds. It is really hard. And then we have the problem with the absorptive capacity because the funding is just too large for those community organizations to deliver the projects with the money they have. So it is a complicated landscape, especially with the Green Climate Fund. We hear criticism all the time.
Great, thank you. And then Roland, same question.
Thanks, Luke. Just very quickly on the parametric sort of triggers and that sort of thing. I mean, it's not my idea, but I remember listening to some sovereign debt experts talking about the pauses, and a good idea that I've always thought is to create some sort of fallback option, fallback trigger, which it could be something along the lines of if the country as a result goes to the IMF for a crisis, shock response program, right? One of the rapid relief and so on, right? So then there is a more detailed assessment, and then you've got something which is balanced halfway between a country choosing that this is actually sufficient, we've been hit sufficiently hard, we want to activate this thing, but there's also some sort of check, right, which is basically the IMF, and a lot of countries don't want to go to the IMF, right? So there's a strong disincentive to engage in this unnecessarily. I think I've always thought that is a useful sort of thing that should be put on the table in those discussions. Very as a backup option. Very quickly on this issue about what countries use it for. I mean, colleagues here are right in all of that. What we highlight in the paper is that small states do tend to disproportionately, use the financing that they receive, including adaptation finance for basically infrastructure, transport, connectivity projects. That makes a lot of sense because a lot of them are remote, and costs of building stuff is actually very high in these countries, right? They have high cost structures, so that makes sense. On the other hand, one of the things that we've also been highlighting in a lot of our work, and my colleague Alex Diant from Lowy is here as well, is that certainly in the Pacific region where we focus more heavily, we see that there's a lot more money going into infrastructure, and that's good, except that if the overall pot has not actually grown, we're seeing that this is coming at the expense of something else, and it has been coming at the expense of the human development sectors in health and education in particular. Social protection related spending is going up, but from a very low base. So if you think of human development as a critical priority, particularly where jobs and mobility, labor mobility, all these things are super important, but obviously this matters in its own right, then there's an issue there. I think one of the other issues, another sort of critical one, is that although it goes into these transport and connectivity projects, it tends to go into big, large scale projects. And so, politicians like cutting ribbons on both sides of the equation, the donor side, the recipient side. What gets left out? Your small scale community works, which is critical for adaptation, and your regular maintenance expenditures as well, which no one has an incentive to keep that up. So that's another sort of gap that occurs as a result of how things are currently done. And I think the capacity issue, plays into that as well. It results in small island states, relying very heavily in many ways on the development partner, either directly or where the partner is providing the support, or as the intermediary for something like the GCF. And that means that the countries have to find an alignment between what they want to do and what those development partners want to do for a variety of reasons, and therefore you get more stuff falling through the cracks. So the capacity thing is kind of central, cutting across everything, right? But I think at a certain level it goes to the ability of governments to get their development partners to do what they want them to do.
Great, thanks.
Can I just yeah. I think one important thing to mention here is also that there's, like you said, there's always the response to the donor, what they see as appropriate to use the funding for. And I think really important would also be to provide some sort of flexibility that comes with the fund, so that countries are able to decide themselves what is important within those projects, rather than fulfilling donor preferences.
Okay, thanks. Okay. And so last question to the group. Looking forward now, what are some of the gaps and opportunities out there for SIDS? So Melanie, would you like to talk a little bit about the loss and damage fund?
Yeah. Yeah, so of course, love to talk about loss and damage. It's one of my areas that I work in and follow closely, also within the UNFCCC and the negotiations. And for those of you who might not know, the loss and damage, sort of the now called the third pillar of climate change action, or amongst adaptation and mitigation. I think that is really that is still a gap, even though there was the fund established in 2 years ago, because there was literally nothing out there that would address loss and damage. So there was the sort of agreement that funds like the GCF, the Adaptation Fund, the World Bank, and any money that's really flowing into small island developing states would avert and minimize loss and damage, but the part of addressing was really missing, and the fund is meant to fill that gap. One of the things that I think is very interesting is that it's meant to be different from the business as usual, and address all those issues like accreditation, direct access, but it's really not set up. It's more like a wish list of what we think needs to happen. And it has always been very highly advocated for by small island developing states as well. So there is so I think that is a major gap, and I think in SIDS especially, what we don't see are non-economic losses that are really not being addressed by any of the funds. I don't think the World Bank or would give the SIDS the funds to address non-economic losses like loss of culture, loss of sovereignty, loss of territory. So that's one of the mandates that the fund has. But again, that's really hard to find measures that are appropriate to be used. And we just published a brief on what the loss and damage fund could look like. So I have described the inner workings of it and provide some concrete suggestions of things that need to be included. There's problems always has been with allocation in the past, where really, even though there is a focus on providing funds to the most vulnerable, a lot of the time there's actually no correlation between the funding that's being dispersed as well as the vulnerability of countries. So the GCF is one of the always, unfortunately, I don't want to hit on them too much, but a prominent example. The GCF does have it, we shouldn't get rid of it, obviously, but it is a good example of what not to do. And I know they're always also trying to fix that. And I know colleagues are working hard on it, but it's a good example to say, well, let's just not do the same mistakes and really learn from what has not been working. So I'm very happy to talk about that in a more detailed way. So we're suggesting, for example, a multi-criteria allocation mechanism that takes other things into consideration, not just vulnerability, but also when it comes to loss and damage, we're also talking about the CBDRN principle of common, CBDR principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, where we now need to look into GDP capacity as well as greenhouse gas emissions in terms of fairness and responsibility. So these are some of the things that are suggested in our brief to address the gap of loss and damage finance to small island developing states. I'll leave it there.
Great, thanks. And Roland, I know you have a couple of ideas you'd like to float about stretching things for SIDS. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you, Vic. Yeah, I mean, I think in general, I mean, it's good to have a discussion with this group and be putting on the agenda, trying to think of how to go further with small states. I mean, I think we all know, anyone who works on SIDS knows like the fundamental challenge. I mean, there's very, very high needs, including related to climate change, but also your basic traditional development needs. They already receive the highest amounts of aid per capita and as a share of GDP of any developing countries, yet any estimate of the need, the financing gap for what is actually required, the gaps are also the largest. So they already receive the most, but they also face the largest gap. And then on top of that, the institutional constraints are very large as well. And you need grants primarily or extremely concessional finance, right? So you're sort of left in this kind of conundrum where there's clearly a need to do more, but it's really hard to do more. And I think we get stuck with saying, okay, well then let's just work with what we've got. And you end up sort of operating only, within a very limited kind of circle. So just to throw a few things out there, I mean, I think one of the things that we know is that basically, particularly when we're talking about climate change and adaptation, is that prevention is going to be better than cure, right? There's a lot of studies that show that upfront adaptation is going to be much more cost effective than not doing that, waiting for the shock to come, having to repair and rebuild afterwards, right? So, if you're if you're on the donor side and you're thinking, oh, what's the best way for me to actually provide support that's actually going to save me money, it makes a lot more sense actually to scale up now rather than to have to scale up later, right? Or to have less effective aid later, right? So there's an argument there for doing something now up front that I think is pretty robust and needs to be absorbed by the international community and the debate, particularly in small states, given they are the most vulnerable, but also because they are small, right? There's not a lot of money that you're ultimately talking about. It is more feasible to talk about scaling up and scaling down and things like this rather than the entire sort of developing world, right? Because then you're talking very large sums of money. It becomes more fiscally difficult to achieve that on the donor side of things. The question then, one of the barriers, of course, then what do you do about the capacity constraint? Because it's still kind of there, right? So what do you do about that? Well, I think it's pretty obvious, and Nemi already sort of mentioned it, right? There needs to be capacity support whenever there's any development project. So if you're going to be scaling up the financing, if that's what you want to do, then obviously part of that has to be scaling up the capacity support as well. And a lot of the smaller SIDS, that's going to be basically your kind of capacity substitution to a significant degree. None of that is perfect. You can't say that you just double the capacity support, you can double the amount of financing, but you can probably make a pretty good difference, right, by doing that. So that's got to be clearly part of the equation. I think the other element is, as I said earlier, there are a lot of things that aren't getting that much financial support to begin with, right? And that's an area where the absorptive capacity is probably going to be higher. So actually, certainly in the Pacific region, from the research we've been doing, the amount of human development support is actually going down in dollar terms. It's less than it used to be, right? So immediately there's probably a capacity to absorb more spending on that front. Maintenance has never gotten enough, and we know it has a very good return on investment, right? So that's another area where you could actually scale up again. Small scale capital works, community development. That's probably harder, but it's something that certainly it's an area where maybe you take on more risk in trying to reach communities, right? And trying to do more and respond to that. A really simple way to do more would just be when it comes to World Bank and IDA, would be increasing the crisis response window, right? It's much more relevant to small states, and you can't doubt that there's either enough financing coming in after a disaster, but also that it would actually be quite high return, right? Coming out of a massive shock, to just throw some extra funding in there that way is going to be useful. Beyond that, I mean, I think the more speculative sort of stuff, right? But I think we should be talking about is how to stretch what we've got further. And so in the paper, one thing we talk about is the idea that if you're talking about a sort of macro critical adaptation investment, but you've got a limited amount of grants, and maybe some entities like the World Bank or other MDBs could think about, can you substitute some of those grants for a slightly larger sort of concessional loan volume in order to get over the line and finance a larger adaptation project, given we know that adaptation can actually improve your resilience to future shocks and therefore, in a way, improve your debt sustainability, the ability to carry that debt. The IMF's done some nice modeling work, which actually shows that for a number of small island states like Samoa, a very nice sort of modeling exercise there. I think there's still risks relying on a modeling exercise, but nonetheless, the way debt is assessed then would need to get a lot better. The way climate change is integrated at the moment is still pretty haphazard and not necessarily that robust. So I think that's part of the issues there. I think there should be a much larger discussion around state contingent debt instruments as well, right? There's a discussion that's not really gotten very far. At the end of the day, we've got climate debt pauses now. That's about it. But what about something that's much more contingent that allows countries to, say, borrow, invest in upfront in adaptation, and if they get hit by a big enough shock or the project doesn't have the benefits that people thought it would, that there is some ability from the international community then to absorb that and reduce the debt appropriately, right? Like, again, because the small island states are small at the end of the day, not a big chunk of the money we're talking about, the ability to shift that risk from the recipient onto the donor development partner side is probably worthwhile. And the final one I'll throw out there, and I think most people are familiar enough with it, is what about something like the IFIM, right? The Innovative Financing Facility for Immunization, where donors commit to repay into a facility in the future, but the facility is able to borrow now from capital markets and invest in adaptation now, with donors spreading out the cost into the future. That lines up nicely with the idea that prevention is better than cure, particularly if you're, for a lot of many bilateral donors that for political reasons would feel on the hook anyway. If countries get hit by shocks 10 years from now, then it's always difficult to do politically, but definitely the financial economic logic of doing something like that could make sense. There's a lot of technical detail with all of those things that would need to be worked out, but I think putting those sort of things on the agenda, I think that would be worthwhile. I'll leave it there.
Can I just add on to those three ideas? Three ideas as well. So I think we also mentioned a lot that this, like Roland said, we're stretching resources, and we're not necessarily really scaling up the funding that is required. And like Roland said, money's taken away from development or other priorities and development aspirations, and now is being invested into climate change initiatives. And also in the paper for the Loss and Damage Fund, we're suggesting that there needs to be more money needs to come in order to pay for grants, really, for adaptation in the Pacific, because that is really what is needed. And we need to look more into those innovative funding sources. And we're a think tank, so we do think a lot, and we come up with hopefully innovative solutions. And one of them is voluntary market mechanisms. And the emphasis here is really on voluntary. How can you get countries to raise funds through market mechanisms, through your old-fashioned taxes and levies, whatever you want to call it, and then either channel them into the Loss and Damage Fund, into the Green Climate Fund, wherever you want to put it, or where the country seems appropriate, in order to really scale up the funding that is required. And a really good example is France, who started an airplane levy in 2006, and part of that funding is channeled into unit aid, which is for health-related initiatives. So that's one thing that we're suggesting, that you need to scale up finance. We need to think outside the box. We're stretching resources too much. Concessional loans only get us so far. We have a debt crisis, a global debt crisis within a lot of countries, and also countries in also SID. So that's one innovative source how we could scale up finance that is really would be grants, right? And you could also do that with the CBAM, where you use the tariffs and also, again, channel them into a fund that can be accessed by SIDS. And the other one that really needs to be looked at is using philanthropic organizations, because there's appetite within the philanthropic sector, but there's also, and it is an untapped resource. But one of the things that I argue is we shouldn't be looking at private investors within the philanthropic landscape. We should really look into, and that's a hard thing to do, engage philanthropists who are willing to put money towards climate change initiatives where we say, well, that's really a grant. This is not something that's not a private investor wanting to build solar panels and have a return on investment. We're talking at no strings attached finance in order to scale up the funding that is available. And I think there's a lot of research needed about picking apart the philanthropic landscape, because you have your Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who really donate to causes, and then you have foundations giving grants to community groups who then deliver the projects. But then you also have celebrities, for example, donating to foundations. So there's really a very scattered landscape where you could maybe strategically pool funding from foundations and make use of the money that's sort of spent in different directions, and obviously with donor preferences as well. So that's some of the ideas that we are throwing out there in the paper. And like I said, it's not just contained to loss and damage. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
And then, Namir, I'll give you the last word. Where would you like to see the international community focusing in terms of opportunities and challenges for cities?
Thanks, Vic. I'll be very short. I think Roland and Melanie have mentioned all the issues I wanted to mention, but just to reiterate that, yes, in the aftermath of the COVID and resulting poly crisis, a lot of the small states have been left with elevated debt levels and are very sensitive to pricing and managing very sensitive situations of maintaining debt sustainability. So yes, a lot more significant grant funding and concessional funding would be highly beneficial to small states. I think one issue that I'd like to mention is like the World Bank has been doing its part in incorporating vulnerability into its especially IDA mechanism. I think so. The World Bank is a development financing institution, and the climate financing is a major critical component of it, but it's not 100% of it. So we've made internal targets of 45% of all annual financing will go towards climate, and they're targeting a 50-50 ratio between adaptation and mitigation. That being said, I think most of the complaints that come when they say move beyond GNI per capita, move beyond normal access criteria, and the complaints about not incorporating vulnerability are more towards the climate funds. And I think climate funds need to do more in terms of incorporating vulnerability into their access and allocation methodologies, and ensure that funds are distributed effectively and efficiently to support those that need it the most. I think that's what needs to change, and needs to change quickly. Thanks.
Well, thank all three of you very much for a really fascinating discussion. I really enjoyed it. So that concludes this part of the session.